Have you heard about focus stacking? It's a really cool technique that helps you overcome the optical limits of macro photography. I'm going to tell you how to do it on today's episode of
Ask David Bergman.
Hey there everybody, welcome back. Here I am, as always, answering your photography questions right here on Adorama TV. If you've got a photo question, just go to askdavidbergman.com, submit that form on the site, and I just might pick your question to answer right here on a future show. Today's question is from Susan T, and she wants to know, hey David, I recently got myself a macro lens and I've been having a blast taking super close-up photos of everything in my house. I'm having trouble getting some things entirely in focus, even at f/32. Is that normal and what can I do about it? Thanks so much, Susan, for sending in that question. I do really appreciate it. Macro photography, it's really fun, right? It lets you capture details that are hard to see with the naked eye. But as you've noticed, when you get that close, there are some optical limits. First of all lenses have a minimum focusing distance. That's as close as you can get while still being able to focus. By the way, people don't realize that focusing distance is measured from the sensor, not from the front of the lens. This lens here, this is the Canon RF 85mm f1.2 lens, and it has a minimum focusing distance of about 33 inches. That's like out here. That's about how far that is. That's a lot, 33 inches. So you can't really get super close. If I want to photograph this little tiny guitar pick from that distance, you can see how small that actually is. Now this is the Canon RF 100mm macro lens. It's a dedicated macro lens, and it has a minimum focusing distance of about 10 inches. That's like here, if the sensor is back here, right? 10 inches. That means I can get much closer and fill the frame with just the center portion of that very same pick. Now, macro lenses typically have a magnification ratio of at least 1:1, meaning the subject is the same size on the sensor as it is in real life. Now, this Canon lens actually goes even further to 1.4 times magnification, which is pretty awesome for getting those super close-up images. Now, there are macro lenses that get to 5 times magnification, but they're not that common and mostly used for specialty work. Now, there are other ways to shoot close-up shots, like using extension tubes or even reversing a lens. You could take the lens off your camera, flip it around, and kind of hold it up and shoot through it that way. You're going to get some macro images that way, but it's obviously not very good image quality to do that. For the best quality, a dedicated macro is really your best bet. Now here's where depth of field comes into play. When your subject is flat and parallel to the sensor, like that guitar pick, depth of field isn't really a big problem. But with three-dimensional subjects that aren't parallel, you're going to see the limits of depth of field when you get that close. As you know, your aperture controls the size of the lens opening, and in addition to your exposure, it also affects how much of your subject is in focus. While stopping down to a smaller aperture like f/32 gives you more depth of field, magnification also plays a really big role. At higher magnifications, depth of field gets a lot smaller, which is why macro photos still have a very small focus area, even at smaller apertures. A classic way to demonstrate this is by photographing a watch. You may have noticed I've been wearing this really cool timepiece from the Swiss brand Oris. This is the ProPilot X caliber 115. It has an industrial skeletonized design that I really like. I photographed it earlier today and I wanted it to be at an angle and not parallel to the sensor, but I still want the entire watch face to be sharp so you can see all of the cool details going on in there. And using my Canon R5 Mark II and the 100mm macro at f2.8, I manually focused on the Oris brand name. And when I zoom in on the final photo, you can see that only a tiny slice is in focus because the depth of field is super shallow. Now then, I close down f/32 and the watch seems to be much sharper. But when you zoom in, everything looks just kind of fuzzy, right? I hate that word, fuzzy, but that's what it is. It's just fuzzy. It's not quite as sharp as you'd expect from a lens of that quality. What that is that's called lens diffraction. On all lenses, the more you close down, the more light waves bend around the aperture blades, causing a softness that's even more noticeable on today's modern high-res sensors. So really, for best quality, you want to stay around your lens's sweet spot. That's about 2 to 3 stops down from wide open. Now, the macro lens that I've been using is a 2.8, so that's between f5.6 and f8 for the sweet spot. Now I shot this image at 7.1 and it's only slightly sharper than the 2.8 shot, but you can tell how much image quality we're getting there. That part that's sharp is super sharp and it looks really, really nice. We can see every little detail there. but we've got still a shallow depth of field even at 7.1. Sidebar, I did keep my lighting really simple on this watch shoot because this video is just about focusing. If you want to talk about how to photograph watches and reflective subjects, go ahead and send that question into Ask David Bergman. I'll get to it on another show. But here's another little tip when photographing watches. Normally, you should set the time to about 10 after 10 so the hands don't cover the brand name of the watch you're photographing. This particular watch is a bit unusual with all of those exposed gears, so I've got it stopped at 151. That way it doesn't cover up the 10-day power reserve dial, which is a really unique feature I'd want to show off if Oris was my client. So having said that, how do I get everything in focus while still shooting at my sweet spot? This is where focus stacking comes in. Focus stacking involves shooting multiple images, each with the focus set at a slightly different point, covering the subject from front to back. Then in post, you stack those images to make a composite with everything in focus. Now, when you're taking those pictures, you want to do it in a way that's called focus bracketing. There are two main ways to do that focus bracketing. One is to keep the focus fixed and then move the camera or the subject slightly between each shot. And you can use something like the Manfrotto 454 positioning plate. It's a macro focusing rail that you put on a tripod, and with your camera on top, it allows you to slide it forward and backward in very tiny increments. Now, manual rails like that are a good entry into macro work, but if I were doing small product photography for a living, I'd probably invest in an automated slider that moves the camera on its own for consistency and speed. I'll link to a model from Novoflex in the description below. Now, whichever type you use, whether you go manual or automatic, make sure your camera is level with it to avoid parallax issues, turn off image stabilization since you're on a tripod, set a low ISO for best image quality, and use a cable release or the delay timer, preferably with the electronic shutter so you don't shake the camera when you're taking pictures. Okay, so the other way to create the series of images for stacking is to change the focus instead of the distance. Many modern cameras today, like the R5 Mark II, offer built-in focus stacking where you just set the number of shots and the focus increment. It can even create a single JPEG composite in camera if you want. Personally, I shoot RAW and prefer to do the conversions and combine the files myself in post, but whatever works for you, knock yourself out. Now, I set up my camera to shoot 50 images in this focus stack earlier today, and it just did it automatically. You can see how it changed the focus a little bit on each frame. Now, it may take some trial and error to get your settings just right, but once you've got everything locked in, it just works. Now, which method is better, changing distance or focus? Well, I'd say for super small objects at higher magnification, like if you're photographing the eyes on an insect, I'd prefer a slider for super precise control. For less extreme shots or larger subjects, changing focus in camera can be super convenient, especially if you're hand-holding and not using a tripod. And by the way, you can also use focus stacking for non-macro shots. In landscape photography, for example, stacking lets you get both foreground, middle ground, and background, all of that in focus without shooting at f32 and risking diffraction of your image. Now, after you've got all your images, if you didn't stack them in camera, you're still going to need to composite them in the computer. Most of us already have Photoshop, and that actually has the function already built in. You just go to File, then Scripts, then Load Images into a stack. Select all the files and check Attempt to automatically align source images, then just hit OK. It'll put them in a new document on individual layers. Then you just highlight all the layers, and under Edit, select Auto Blend Layers. Make sure you check Stack Images and Seamless Tones and Colors. That's going to blend it a little bit better. It's going to be looking for those to make sure it blends smoothly. Photoshop's going to churn away, and it might take a while if you have a lot of images. It'll find the in-focus parts of each image and combine them into one photo. Now, Photoshop works great for basic stacking, but for complex projects, I'd say you should probably purchase dedicated software like Zarine Stacker or Helicon Focus. Helicon has different blending methods for fine detail work, while Zarine offers excellent retouching tools to fine-tune each layer. It's not uncommon to save different stacked versions and then blend those together to really dial in the sharpness and control which areas are in focus. And one last option I should mention to get my watch face in focus is to use a tilt-shift lens or extension bellows. And that's going to allow you to change the angle of the focus plane to have it lined up with the watch. Tilt-shift lenses can be a little finicky. They're kind of hard to get exactly the angle you want, and you should work maybe on a big monitor so you can really see what's happening. They're also more expensive and less common than dedicated macro lenses. And I told you it can't focus as close as the Canon 100 macro anyway. The Canon 90mm tilt shift is manual focus only with a minimum focusing distance of just over 15 inches. I wouldn't use it for something super small like insects, but for larger items and for landscapes, tilt shift lenses might be a good option to try, especially if you already have one. So Susan, I hope that helps explain why your macro photos aren't as sharp as you wanted and gives you a few options on how you can fix them. What do you all think? Do you use focus stacking? Have you ever tried it? Do you have any tips for Susan and everyone else that I didn't cover here? Let me know in the comments below. Remember, you can send in your own photo questions by going to askdavidbergman.com. If you like these videos, I do appreciate you hitting that like button and, of course, subscribing to the Adorama YouTube channel. Make sure you click that bell icon so you're notified when new shows come out from me and all the hosts right here on Adorama TV. Thanks so much for joining me, and I hope to see you next time right here on Ask David Bergman.